Assisi, probably beyond a doubt one of the most popular saints worldwide. Here's an overview of his life. Born around 1181 in Assisi, Italy, St. Francis began his life as a confirmed sinner. His father was a wealthy cloth merchant who owned farmland around Assisi, and his mother was a beautiful French woman. Francis was not poor. In fact, he was spoiled, indulging himself with fine food, drink, and wild celebrations. By the age of 14, he had left school and was a rebellious teenager who frequently drank and broke the city curfew. He was known, though, for his charm and his vanity. In these privileged surroundings, Francis learned the skills of archery, wrestling, and horsemanship. He was expected to follow his father into the family textile business, but was bored by the prospect of life in the cloth trade. Instead, he dreamed of a future as a knight, these medieval action heroes. And if Francis had any ambition, it was to be a war hero like them. It wouldn't be long before the opportunity for warfare called. In 1202, war broke out between Assisi and Perugia, and Francis eagerly took his place with the cavalry. Little did he know at the time that his experience with war would change him forever. Francis and the other men of Assisi came under heavy attack, and in the face of superior numbers, they took flight. The whole battlefield was soon covered with the bodies of butchered, mutilated men screaming in agony. Unskilled and with no combat experience, Francis was quickly captured by enemies. Dressed like an aristocrat and wearing expensive armor, he was considered worthy of ransom, and the soldiers decided to spare his life. He and the other troops were taken as prisoners, led off to a dank underground cell. Francis would spend nearly a year in such miserable conditions, awaiting his father's payment, during which time he may well have contracted serious illness. Also during this time, he would later report, he began to receive visions from God. After a year of negotiations, Francis's ransom was accepted, and he was released in prison in 1203. When he came back to Assisi, however, Francis was a very different man. Upon his return, he was dangerously sick in both mind and body, a battle-fatigued casualty of war. Subsequently, Francis, now in his early 20s, began turning his focus toward God. He spent an ever-increasing amount of time at a remote mountain hideaway, as well as in old, quiet churches around Assisi, praying, looking for answers, and helping nurse lepers and the sick. During this time, while praying before an old Byzantine crucifix at the Church of San Damiano, Francis reportedly heard the voice of Jesus, who told him to rebuild the church and to live a life of poverty. Francis obeyed and devoted himself to the Christian life. He began preaching around Assisi and was soon joined by 12 loyal followers. After renouncing his inheritance, Francis began embracing a life of extreme poverty. This Christ-like poverty was a radical notion at that time. The Christian church was itself rich in many ways, which concerned Francis and others who felt that the long-held apostolic ideals had been eroded. Francis set out on a mission to restore Jesus' original values to what he saw as a decadent church. With his charisma, he drew thousands of followers to him. They listened to his sermons and joined in his way of life. His followers became known as friars. Continuously pushing himself in the quest for spiritual perfection, Francis was soon preaching in up to 5 villages a day, teaching a new kind of personal spirituality that common people could understand. He even went so far as to preach to animals, which garnered criticism from some and earned him the nickname God's Fool. But Francis's message was spread far and wide. Thousands of people were captivated by what they heard, including some women who, with the help of Francis, began a new religious community before Francis reportedly received a vision that left him with the stigmata of Christ, marks resembling the wounds that Jesus suffered when he was crucified, through his hands and a gaping lance wound in his side. This made Francis the first person to receive the holy wounds of the stigmata. They would remain visible for the rest of his life. Because of his earlier work with lepers, some believe that the wounds were actually symptoms of leprosy. As Francis approached his death, many predicted that he was a saint in the making. When his health began to decline more rapidly, he went home. Knights were sent from Assisi to guard him and to make sure that no one from neighboring towns would carry him off, because the body of the saint was viewed at the time as an extremely valuable relic that would bring, among many things, glory to the town where it rested. Francis of Assisi died on October 3rd, 1226, at the age of 44, his body racked by illness. He was nearly blind. Today, Francis has a lasting resonance with millions of followers across the globe. He was canonized as a saint just 2 years after his death, on July 16, 1228, by his former protector, Pope Gregory IX. Today, Francis of Assisi is the patron saint of Italy and of ecologists, a title honoring his boundless love for animals and nature. Interest in the life of St. Francis peaked with the election of Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, who was the first pope to take the name of Francis. At his first audience in March 2013, Pope Francis told journalists that he had chosen the name in honor of St. Francis of Assisi, and had done so because he was especially concerned for the well-being of the poor. He explained that as it was becoming clear during the conclave voting that he would be elected pope, the Brazilian Cardinal Claudio had embraced him and whispered, "Don't forget the poor," which had made Bergoglio think of the saint. Bergoglio had previously expressed his admiration for St. Francis, explaining that he brought to Christianity an idea of poverty against the luxury, pride, vanity of the civil and ecclesiastical powers of the time. He changed history. Another lasting contribution of St. Francis was his attempt to reach out to the Muslims, to convert the Sultan of Egypt. While he was not successful in doing so, he became friends with the Sultan, who later allowed the Franciscan community to become patrons of the sacred sites in the Holy Land. To this day, the Franciscan community is the overseer of Christian shrines in Israel. When we think about St. Francis, we may have nostalgic ideas about the life he lived. However, living the life of Christ was no easy task then, nor is it an easy task today. Poverty, simplicity, obedience, prayer, these are difficult to practice. The life of Christ runs counter to the philosophy and practices of our contemporary world. It requires us to abandon our worldly dreams and to surrender ourselves to the will of God in all things. This is the enduring attraction of St. Francis, the ability to let go of all this world finds important, to embrace the way of Christ.